Begin with something that began serious, involves a tragedy, and now is a full-blown catastrophe on multiple levels for the Trump administration and also the United States Pentagon. There are clouds clearly gathering around Pentagon Chief Hegseth, and we are getting the new details, which is partly a bad thing. There's a problem here, and most people see that the government has a problem. But there's also transparency, accountability, and even bipartisan pressure at work, something that Donald Trump, on his worst autocratic days, has tried to argue, claim, or pretend doesn't happen anymore. That he could be, as some of the protesters say, a king not subject to oversight. And yet here we are dealing with matters of life and death and war, and the oversight is, in a way, working because we're learning things. Doesn't mean we're in the clear. I'm not telling you this is all fixed and some of the lives lost are lost for good. But that brings me to how we are basically ending this week with some chilling new details about the deadly strike that, according to legal experts and many veterans who work in this space, appears on its face from the video evidence to constitute a war crime committed by the United States under the Trump administration. There are serious questions about the two shipwrecked survivors of what was that first attack and whether, once they were survivors, right, that's the term of art in law and combat. We've all heard about having survivors of war and having detainees. If you think back and you're not a legal expert, why do we have so many discussions about detainees, even in the greatest wars, the World War II or the so-called War on Terror, where we were told these terrorists were terrible, and they were, but if they were caught alive, we followed the rules, the Geneva Conventions. You can think of examples where we didn't, and those were multi-year scandals. But in general, we have detainees, we have survivors of war, enemy combatants, and the rest because we don't execute everyone. I say that as the baseline to remind you why this is such a big deal. The September 2nd attack involved on video the apparent killing or execution of those shipwreck survivors. Now we're getting more reporting about the video evidence. The New York Times, this came late today, says a new detail about the survivors of a U.S. military strike on a boat in the Caribbean further complicates the military's explanations for launching that, quote, follow-up attack that killed them. That is, of course, the strike that is sometimes proverbially referred to this week as the second strike. Quote, multiple people who've seen video of the attacks say the survivors climbed on the overturned hull and waved to something overhead, a gesture interpreted as an attempt to surrender, beckoning rescue, or trying to signal other alleged drug traffickers. You can see there the debate about what the signal meant and whether they were a threat or not. Now, the Times reports some who viewed the video said the most logical explanation was that the two survivors had seen the American aircraft above them and started signaling for a rescue. It's not clear from the video what the survivors had definitely seen the American aircraft, whether or not they had. All of this adding to the accounts from lawmakers who, of course, are putting on this bipartisan pressure, which is why so quickly some information, video, and testimony has come out. They were able to view what the United States military under the Trump administration is still not releasing, the video of the second attack. And they said the survivors, according to some lawmakers, appeared to be trying to flip the remnants of their boat. One lawmaker recounting there was no boat, there was wreckage. Again, by the way, I'll leave this quote up, but that's why we've heard this described by some credible sources as shipwrecked survivors, not exactly people running a functioning vessel at that point. Continuing the quote, there was no radio. There were two guys clinging to a tiny, non-awash portion of the keel of a capsized boat. It would be important if there was no radio or international signaling process, right? Audio or I guess perhaps something else in the water. But if there's no radio and no signaling, then well, that's going to affect what they were able to do, and the argument or explanation that some around the Pentagon have offered that maybe they were still communicating and thus some type of threat. There was this classified briefing from Admiral Bradley, who oversaw these strikes under Pentagon Chief Hegseth. Again, reading from the reporting of the New York Times journalists, quote, amid preparations for the briefing, U.S. officials told the Times they had been told one of the survivors had radioed for help. But the people said remarks from Admiral Bradley about communications were instead purely speculative. The reason for the disconnect was not clear. You'll notice that word from the Times, disconnect. That is diplomatic. And as I've reported and serious people have mentioned, this is a process story. This is not a story where you know everything that happened. But if disconnect turns into cover-up or lies about an alleged war crime, Well, the Trump administration's problems are going to increase, not decrease. There is bipartisan pressure, but there also, as some of the material has started coming out, a split. We've often seen that in congressional politics. Some of the Democrats say it's very clear what they saw on video.
First of all, we need to be clear. There was no fog of war. They had a clear vision of these two people on top of what was left of their capsized boat for quite a while. I saw Senator Cotton say that the two gentlemen were trying to turn their boat back up, I guess. That is patently ridiculous. That boat wasn't going anywhere.
Anybody who sees that video would have real questions about whether the United States is abiding by the values that distinguish us around the world.
There are questions about why the Trump administration is holding back the video of the second strike. If the videos here are part of an important investigative review of these warlike actions from an administration that says it has wartime powers, from immigration to bombing vessels that aren't part of a country we're at war with, then surely the oversight of this non-war lethal activity can include all the video, not just some that is selectively released. We have video, of course, from the first strike. Administration does release strike videos. Indeed, at times, it is strike videos that this, and to be fair, some other administrations have touted to show the might of the American military, and even some argue the deterrent effect of showing enemies, be they in boats with contraband and drugs, or worse, terrorists and foreign fighters, look what the U.S. can do. Now, suddenly, this video-first policy is being held back when it comes to the second strike. Trump, though, has claimed there'd be no problem with releasing video of the second strike.
Will you release video of that strike so that the American people can see for themselves what happened?
I don't know what they have, but whatever they have, we'd certainly release. No problem.
There is an echo here of so many other things with this president. We'll release the Epstein files, except they've been in his control the whole time and he hasn't released them. You go back to the first term. I have no problem talking to Bob Mueller, but he never did. Donald Trump is, if nothing else, very good at keeping an eye on the PR and the headlines he wants. And while I think some of the press has wised up over time, and certainly some of the public, if you look at the reaction to Donald Trump's misleading statements about high inflation or prices, just to pick a very different issue, plenty of the public has wised up to this. What he's seeking, what you won't see on our headline right now, you see we're talking about Pentagon Chief Hegseth under fire, but he is, just as a political and public relations matter, according to the past evidence, he's seeking headlines that say he's fine with the release, just like he got headlines about being fine with talking to Mueller. Well, the buck stops with the leadership, in this case, the Pentagon chief and the president. And if they want the video out, it should be out. And every day that it goes by and it's not out, that buck stops at the president's desk, where his secrecy problem stretches from his own past dealings with Epstein, which has a looming deadline this month, of course, to whatever his administration's currently doing with Epstein's co-conspirator, giving her lenient treatment, to whatever's going on in this video, and a heck of a lot of other stuff, crypto, corruption allegations about deals they've cut relating to war and Russia. There's a lot of secrecy. And that makes you wonder, what are they hiding? And in our skeptical internet era, a heck of a lot more people, including on the center and the center right, maybe not pure loyal MAGA, but a heck of a lot more people are not naturally just trusting the government, telling them on any of the issues I just mentioned, including this strike, trust us, you don't need to see the evidence with your own eyes. Here's what one military lawyer said. It's hard to see any argument that the follow-up strike was lawful unless one accepts a series of premises, that the U.S. is in a war with drug traffickers. That's that claimed wartime power I mentioned earlier that Congress hasn't declared. Quote, a broad array of legal analysts dispute the idea that we would just be in a endless actual drug war. Second, that the two survivors were on board a seaworthy vessel and not at risk of drowning, that the drugs in the boat itself were military objects. Stack that all up and you have something more like a law school exam hypothetical, something much closer to that than the actual legal justification for some of what you see on your screen. Now, the Pentagon continues to carry out strikes. They did a new one late Thursday night. The total number of these strikes is over 20 estimated, and they have killed 86 people. Remember, a whole bunch of people are getting killed by this process, which we now see is, at a minimum, convoluted, and at a maximum, a potential war crime. That's the state of play, with a heck of a lot of secrecy. and the Pentagon chief under fire to a degree that Donald Trump, who used to fire people for fake on TV, his fake firing, his Apprentice show, but lately hasn't shown the ability to demand any accountability and remove people in his administration, despite some of these documented problems.